beneath the ashes of war, where silence swallows truth and shadows guard the ruins, lie stories written not in ink, but in whispers, sealed away behind locked doors and buried in forgotten soil. They are fragments of operations erased from the record, trials conducted in darkness, and machines tested on runways that never officially existed. To approach them is to step into corridors where history flickers like a damaged film reel, full of gaps and static, daring us to fill the void with questions. Here, the line between fact and silence twists into something more dangerous than fiction itself, as if the past itself resists being unearthed. What remains are fragments, cryptic files, abandoned wrecks, anonymous graves that pulse with unanswered meaning. These are not the stories celebrated in textbooks, nor the ones given speeches and medals. These are the ghosts of history, breathing beneath the floorboards, waiting to be heard. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Caesar. In the final months of the Second World War, as Germany's military structure disintegrated under Allied bombardments, a quiet but critical operation was put into motion by the Kriegsmarine. Its name was Operation Caesar, recorded in fragmentary war diaries and intercepted Allied signals. This mission stood apart from the standard resupply and evacuation runs that characterized the dying days of the Third Reich. Caesar was not simply about survival. It was about moving something out of Europe before the Reich fell completely. On 5th March 1945, U-864 slipped out of Bergen, Norway, under orders from Admiral Karl Dönitz himself. Its mission was to deliver supplies, technology, and personnel to the Empire of Japan, Germany's last Axis partner still capable of resisting Allied forces. What makes the mission extraordinary and controversial to this day is not its existence, but what was believed to be inside the reinforced cargo compartments. British decrypts from Bletchley Park revealed repeated references to materials necessary for decisive continuation of research. The decrypted signals did not describe weapons by name, but code words like Schweres and Juret 44-1 appear, which intelligence historians later speculated to be code names for enriched uranium and prototype jet technology. What has troubled investigators is how little survives of the full Caesar file. Several original intercepts were destroyed during post-war archiving, leaving only index cards that refer to documents marked top secret, must not be reproduced. The suspicion is that Allied intelligence had more detailed knowledge of Caesar's true cargo, knowledge that vanished deliberately from public record. U-864's journey was fraught with difficulty from the outset. After leaving Bergen, it suffered mechanical problems with its engines, forcing the crew to return briefly for repairs. That delay, according to surviving fragments from Kriegsmarine logs, nearly cancelled the mission. But by late March, the submarine once again set out into the North Sea. U-864 carried more than its crew of 73 men. According to Norwegian post-war reports, several large steel containers were loaded onto the vessel under heavy SS guard, separate from the standard cargo of mercury flasks officially listed as technical supplies. The secrecy around these containers led to speculation that Caesar was about transferring nuclear-related material to Japan, which had been struggling with its own atomic program. The fact that Japan had requested German technology on several occasions during 1944 lends weight to this theory. On 9th of February 1945, British submarine HMS Venturer, under the command of Lieutenant James Launders, intercepted U-864 off the coast of Fedje, Norway. What followed is remarkable in naval history, the only recorded incident of one submarine sinking another, while both were submerged. Venturer launched 4 torpedoes, one of which struck U-864 amidships, splitting it in two. The submarine sank with all hands lost. For the Allies, it appeared to be a victory that cut off a vital Axis technology exchange. Yet the story does not end with the wreck. Norwegian salvage divers who examined the wreck in the early 2000s reported the presence of thousands of corroding mercury flasks spilling toxins into the seabed. What was less publicized, though recorded in classified Norwegian Environment Ministry files, were the remains of at least 6 larger containers built from reinforced steel and lead. These were not part of standard cargo protocols for U-boats. Requests for further analysis were allegedly blocked due to concerns over international sensitivity. One diver, who later spoke anonymously to a German journalist, described the containers as sealed like coffins, impossible to open without cutting tools. His testimony, though unverified, fed long-standing suspicions that Operation Caesar carried more than mercury. British wartime intelligence officers seemed to believe so as well. A declassified War Office memorandum from April 1945 refers obliquely to cargo consistent with Luftwaffe propulsion research, possibly lost with U-864. This is perplexing. Since Luftwaffe projects were not normally transferred by U-boat, particularly during the collapse of Germany, the memo concludes with the line, confirmation impossible, investigation closed, advise silence. The recommendation to advise silence has led some historians to conclude that the Allies had already secured similar technology elsewhere, possibly through captured facilities in Thuringia or Silesia, and that Caesar's cargo was redundant but politically inconvenient to discuss. The Soviet Union had its own interest in Caesar. NKVD reports from 1946 describe inquiries made to British authorities regarding missing German scientists allegedly assigned to the mission. No such scientists appear on official Kriegsmarine rolls, but the Soviets pressed the issue for years, convinced that their Western allies had seized both personnel and materials before admitting to the sinking. It is possible, as some researchers argue, that the story of U-864's destruction served as cover for an interception and capture operation. The lack of survivors and the impossibility of independent verification in 1945 would have made such a cover story ideal. What complicates matters further are missing American files. The US Navy's technical mission in Europe, which catalogued German scientific assets after the war, kept meticulous inventories. Yet in its thousands of pages, Caesar is referenced only once. In a footnote, transfer attempt, lost at sea, information classified. Researchers examining the archive in the 1970s noted that entire pages appeared to have been removed, leaving gaps in the file numbering. Such deliberate excision is consistent with the suppression of inconvenient intelligence finds. If Caesar did indeed carry early atomic material, both Britain and the United States would have had every reason to keep it hidden during the early Cold War, particularly as the Soviets advanced their own program. Eyewitness accounts add another layer of doubt. In 1946, Norwegian fishermen from the island of Fedje told investigators that they had seen unusual naval activity days after the sinking, including the presence of Allied vessels not normally stationed in the area. Some claimed that salvage operations had taken place under secrecy. Although these accounts remain unverified, the possibility of an early recovery operation cannot be dismissed, especially given the location was known and accessible. If Allied divers retrieved anything, they left little trace beyond local rumor. The true legacy of Operation Caesar lies not in its confirmed details but in its omissions. The lack of documentation, the disappearance of files, the deliberate redactions, all point to a story that was more than a simple U-boat intercept. For decades, historians treated Caesar as an obscure footnote. Only with the opening of archives and the discovery of the wreck has the mystery returned to prominence. The toxic mercury leaking from U-864 remains a physical reminder, but the unknown cargo containers suggest something more significant went down with the submarine. If the mission was intended to alter the balance of power in Japan's favor, it failed. If, however, Caesar served as a channel to move German secrets into Allied hands under controlled conditions, then its sinking was a carefully staged deception. In either case, the secrecy surrounding Operation Caesar has preserved its enigma. The silence of the archives may speak louder than any record. In war, what is erased often reveals as much as what is written. Operation Caesar remains one of those erasures, a vanishing act at sea, hiding knowledge that could have changed the Cold War before it began. Chapter 2: The Secret Trials of Posen Castle. In the aftermath of the war, while the world's attention centered on the spectacle of the Nuremberg proceedings, a quieter and far more secretive set of interrogations took place deep in the ruins of Posen Castle in western Poland. Once a seat of Nazi authority, the castle had been repurposed by Soviet SMERSH, operatives and US counter-intelligence corps officers as a joint facility for handling what were referred to in intercepted memos as sensitive personnel. These were not the familiar faces of Nazi leadership paraded in front of cameras. They were obscure names, engineers, physicians, and SS technical officers connected to classified research programs, some of whom do not appear in post-war employment records or denazification proceedings. The official record is silent, but fragments from Polish archives and survivor testimony hint that a shadow tribunal was conducted here, away from public scrutiny, where justice and secrecy blurred into one. The first references to these events appear in a 1947 Internal Polish Security Service report describing unusual Allied activity around Posen in early 1946. The report notes convoys of American military trucks arriving at night, their cargo escorted by Soviet armored vehicles. The trucks were seen entering the castle's eastern gate and not emerging for days. Villagers reported hearing the sound of engines idling at night, followed by muffled gunfire in the early hours of the morning. At the time, these rumors were dismissed as paranoia in a city still haunted by the war, but subsequent discoveries lend them credibility. In 1963, renovation work in the castle's lower vaults uncovered shackles embedded in the stone walls and iron doors reinforced with welded plates, suggesting their adaptation as holding cells. Theories about what transpired inside Posen Castle gained momentum in the 1990s, when fragments of interrogation transcripts surfaced in the Warsaw State Archive. These papers were discovered misfiled among agricultural records, a common result of hurried Soviet archiving practices. The transcripts, though heavily redacted, contain chilling exchanges. In one fragment, an unnamed German engineer is pressed about field trials at Novaya Zemlya, a geographical error since the nuclear testing range did not yet exist, but which may have referred to early biological weapons experiments on the Eastern Front. Another fragment records a line where the interrogator asks, "Were the prototype engines tested on the Posen grounds or relocated to Thuringia before evacuation?" These references link the interrogations not to war crimes in the conventional sense, but to the pursuit of advanced technologies whose capture could tip the balance of power in the emerging Cold War. American involvement in the trials is harder to prove. The Counterintelligence Corps, CIC files released under the Freedom of Information Act contain oblique references to special handling of scientific suspects. In one memo, dated 17th of February 1946, a CIC officer stationed in Germany writes, "Transfer to Posen confirmed. Soviets request joint session. Authorization required." The memo is stamped with a red secret do not duplicate notice. What makes this remarkable is that Posen was in Soviet occupation territory, and direct US intelligence operations there would have violated established boundaries. Yet cooperation between the two powers, at least temporarily, was not unheard of when it came to extracting German scientific expertise. The joint nature of the trials, if true, would explain why neither side has ever admitted to them. Both had an interest in silencing men who knew too much. Local testimony adds disturbing detail. An elderly resident of Poznan, interviewed in 1978, recalled seeing bodies loaded onto Soviet trucks under canvas tarpaulins, always late at night. She described the trucks heading toward the forests west of the city. Years later, amateur historians searching those forests found unmarked burial pits containing human remains. Officially, the Polish government attributed them to wartime atrocities committed by retreating German forces. However, forensic analysis in the early 2000s indicated that at least some of the remains bore signs of execution by pistol shot to the back of the head, consistent with NKVD methods. No identification tags were recovered, but the remains included skulls with gold-capped teeth, suggesting they may have belonged to professional-class individuals. The castle itself bears silent testimony to its past. Visitors allowed into restricted sections in the 1970s described faded chalk markings on the stone walls, calculations, chemical formulas, and dates scratched by hand. One wall, photographed clandestinely by a Polish researcher, shows the outline of what appears to be a schematic of a jet engine compressor, crudely drawn with charcoal. If authentic, this suggests that the prisoners themselves used their confinement to record fragments of the knowledge they were being forced to reveal. No official body has authenticated the photographs, and the original wall was plastered over during renovations, erasing the evidence. The question of why such trials were kept secret lies in the convergence of morality and power. The Nuremberg trials were designed to establish the principle of accountability before the world's eyes, but Posen Castle may have served a darker purpose: to eliminate individuals whose research could not be allowed to resurface in enemy hands. By conducting these interrogations in silence, the Allies and Soviets could extract technical knowledge while preventing public scrutiny. Men with intimate knowledge of human experimentation, chemical warfare, and rocket propulsion may have been too dangerous to release, yet too valuable to execute without first being drained of information. The result was a hidden tribunal that straddled the line between justice and exploitation. Hints of the castle's true role occasionally slipped into the open. A 1951 CIA analysis on Soviet rocketry refers cryptically to data possibly obtained via unauthorized technical interrogations in Polish territory. The phrase is carefully worded, but intelligence analysts have long argued that it refers to the same events rumored to have taken place in Posen, the Soviet space program's rapid advances in the late 1940s, particularly in jet propulsion and long-range missile development, may have drawn upon knowledge seized there. Likewise, the United States' own recruitment of German scientists under Operation Paperclip left gaps where certain names expected to appear simply vanish from all records. Those names, historians argue, may have been the men who never left Posen Castle alive. Today, the site attracts tourists unaware of its darker post-war role. Guided tours mention the Nazi occupation, but not the clandestine events of 1946. Local historians have petitioned for plaques to commemorate the victims, but official resistance remains strong, with Polish authorities citing insufficient evidence. Perhaps the silence is deliberate, maintained not only by Poland but also by the major powers who conducted the trials. The burial sites in the forests remain unmarked. The fragments of transcripts remain locked away in archives, and the few surviving witnesses are too old to testify. The secret trials of Posen Castle represent a void in the historical record, an absence where accountability should stand. They reveal a hidden postscript to the war, where the victors, in pursuit of power, adopted the methods of their defeated enemy: secrecy, disappearance, and erasure. What happened in those stone chambers in 1946 may never be fully known, but the scattered evidence points to a deliberate effort to bury truths too dangerous to be acknowledged. The trials did not produce verdicts or public justice. They produced silence, the kind that lingers in sealed files and unmarked graves, echoing in the cold corridors of Posen Castle. Chapter 3. Operation Eclipse's Missing War Files. In May 1945, as American and British troops surged into Bavaria and Württemberg, a parallel mission unfolded in near silence. It was called Operation Eclipse. Officially, Eclipse was the Allied directive to seize German government institutions and secure occupied territory. But within the directive lay a series of suborders known as document seizure priorities. These were designed not for battlefield control, but for intelligence acquisition, targeting Nazi archives before they could be destroyed or hidden. Teams composed of US Army officers, Royal Engineers, and civilian specialists moved rapidly behind advancing front lines, cataloguing thousands of crates of documents. Yet among these carefully inventoried shipments, dozens of boxes vanished. The disappearance was noted briefly in logistical reports under the euphemism "file losses, Southern Germany." What these missing files contained has haunted military historians for decades. Surviving manifests from the 69-22nd document exploitation battalion describe technical records of research in propulsion and atomic separation, recovered from facilities in Thuringia and Upper Bavaria. Some were clearly linked to known projects like the V2 missile program, but others bore designations without clear explanation: Gerät 714, Project Morgenrot, Abteilung 6 Kerner. At least 23 crates marked with these identifiers were checked in at collection depots in Augsburg during the first week of May. When the shipments were later tallied at the London Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee CIOS Centre, those crates were absent. Investigators searching in 1946 blamed clerical errors, transport losses, or simple theft, but the systematic removal of an entire series suggests something deliberate. Testimony from a former US Army archivist adds fuel to the suspicion. In a 1972 oral history recorded at the University of Maryland, the archivist, identified only as HM, claimed that he had seen manifests altered under orders from a colonel attached to the Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee. According to his account, crates were diverted not to London, but to a warehouse near Marburg, where civilian contractors in plain clothes oversaw their transfer onto unmarked trucks. When he asked about the missing files later, he was told they had been reclassified and would not appear in the public record. His recollection is consistent with other accounts of intelligence assets being funneled into covert programs outside the knowledge of Allied command structures. British intelligence files declassified in the 1980s contain tantalizing references to these missing records. One CIO summary notes, certain documents related to nuclear metallurgical techniques were found incomplete, suggesting sections removed prior to cataloguing. Another mentions possible cross-reference to Japanese naval intelligence, indicating technical exchange. If accurate, this would place the missing crates at the nexus of German-Japanese collaboration on advanced weapons, a connection the Allies had every incentive to suppress during the opening stages of the Cold War. The last thing London or Washington wanted was public knowledge that their post-war scientific advances might have relied on seized Axis cooperation. The Soviet Union also took notice. Reports from Soviet trophy brigades describe frustration at arriving too late to capture core archives in southern Germany, especially in Munich and Augsburg. Soviet interrogators questioned German archivists, who insisted that entire rooms of records had already been cleared by Americans within hours of the surrender. In 1949, an internal NKVD memorandum, later smuggled to the West by a defector, claimed that the Americans had secured uranium enrichment schemes originally housed at Ohrdruf and transported them east before the Red Army could reach the site. Whether this was exaggeration or accurate intelligence remains unresolved, but it aligns disturbingly well with the vanishing crates of Operation Eclipse. The shadow of these missing files looms over later events. The rapid acceleration of US nuclear capabilities, culminating in the successful test at Bikini Atoll in 1946, raised questions about the sources of American data. Some historians argue that German work on isotope separation had been rudimentary, but others point to documents recovered in Haigerloch and Stadtilm that revealed surprising sophistication. If those were merely the fragments left behind, what might the missing crates have contained? The timing is also suggestive. Within months of the crates disappearing, several private American contractors, most notably Westinghouse and General Electric, began developing propulsion technologies that mirrored abandoned German designs. Internal company archives reveal sudden infusions of data with no documented origin. Eyewitness reports add a human layer to the mystery. A German archivist named Wilhelm Haas, interviewed by Allied officers in 1945, insisted that he had overseen the packing of several crates containing SS documents from Abteilung 6, the intelligence wing of the Reich Security Main Office. He signed receipts confirming their handover to US troops at Augsburg. When later shown manifests from London, he became visibly agitated, pointing out the absence of his crates. His testimony was quietly filed away and never used in post-war trials. Haas himself disappeared from records after 1948, presumed to have emigrated, but no documentation exists of his departure. What makes the story more troubling is that fragments of these files have surfaced in unexpected places. In 1995, researchers combing through a declassified RAND Corporation archive discovered photocopied excerpts of German documents referencing staged detonation protocols and ultrasonic separation methods. The pages bore faint CIOS stamps, but no record exists of their official transfer to RAND. The implication is that the missing crates were not destroyed, but quietly integrated into Cold War research projects, stripped of their origin to avoid political fallout. For the families of those who perished in Nazi experiments, the idea that such research might have been repurposed is a bitter legacy. Even today, the Operation Eclipse files resist clarity. Requests under Britain's Freedom of Information Act for full access to CIOS inventories are routinely denied, citing national security considerations. American records remain fragmented, with multiple series of file numbers missing entirely. Independent researchers have pieced together partial lists of what may have been in the lost crates. Documents on uranium enrichment, jet propulsion beyond the Me-262, chemical agents tested on the Eastern Front, and detailed Japanese-German correspondence on submarine technology. Each clue hints at knowledge the Allies were desperate to keep from the Soviets, knowledge that could alter the post-war balance of power. The mystery of the missing war files is not simply academic. It reflects the blurred lines between justice and exploitation in the aftermath of global conflict. The Allies promised transparency at Nuremberg, yet simultaneously engaged in a hidden war for technology, one that required erasing inconvenient truths. The vanished crates of Operation Eclipse are the embodiment of that erasure. Their absence is a hole in the historical record, carefully maintained to conceal the uncomfortable reality that the post-war order was built not only on victory, but also on silence, suppression, and the quiet absorption of enemy secrets. Chapter 4. The Ghost Airfield of Belarus. In the dense woodlands outside Minsk, the scars of war lie hidden beneath layers of soil and pine. For decades, villagers spoke of a Luftwaffe airfield that had once operated there during the German occupation of Belarus. Official maps mark nothing more than forest and farmland. But satellite reconnaissance during the 1960s identified unusual geometric clearings, runways, overgrown but still visible, converging at sharp angles that betrayed military design. Soviet surveyors sent to the site expected to find nothing more than abandoned fortifications. What they uncovered instead was the decaying infrastructure of an installation unlike any other Luftwaffe outpost. A place where the outlines of history blurred into secrecy and silence. The earliest accounts of the airfield's activity come from villagers in 1943, who recalled distant roars in the night, sounds unlike conventional aircraft engines. They described vibrations that shook window panes and left livestock restless, as if great machines were being tested after dark. During the occupation, civilians were forbidden to approach within 5 kilometers of the site, which was guarded not by ordinary Wehrmacht troops, but by a detachment of the Luftwaffe's Erprobungskommando, a unit known for testing experimental aircraft. Local partisans who attempted reconnaissance never returned, their bodies later discovered at the edge of minefields. The Germans appeared to guard the airfield as though it contained something far more valuable than ordinary bombers or fighters. When Soviet forces recaptured the area in July 1944, they found the airfield hastily abandoned and partially destroyed. Runways were cratered by explosives, hangars burned and equipment removed. Yet traces remained. Soviet engineering reports declassified in the 1990s note the discovery of reinforced testing pits lined with heat-resistant tiles, unlike anything used for conventional aviation. Scattered fragments of fuselages were collected, some bearing alloy compositions unfamiliar to Soviet metallurgists at the time. The engineers reported to Moscow that the site appeared to have hosted jet propulsion experiments, though the full scope was unclear. Their findings were quietly classified and never released to the public. The airfield re-entered the historical record in 1964, when a team of Belarusian surveyors stumbled upon the remnants while mapping new forestry projects. They reported unusual chemical contamination in the soil and structures resembling bunkers concealed beneath layers of earth. Shortly afterward, the Soviet military sealed off the area, citing environmental hazards. Witnesses recalled convoys of military trucks entering the forest at night, and residents were warned not to approach under threat of arrest. For the next 2 decades, the airfield disappeared once again from view, erased from official maps and overshadowed by Soviet industrial expansion. Defectors in the 1970s revealed fragments of the truth. A former Soviet engineer, smuggled to the West, described having been ordered to examine debris recovered from the Belarus site. He claimed the wreckage included turbine blades of advanced design, superior to early Soviet models. The engineer was convinced the Germans had been experimenting with ramjet, or pulse jet propulsion in Belarus, possibly testing aircraft that never entered production before the war's end. His account was met with skepticism until other testimonies emerged, describing the relocation of captured German engineers from Belarus to closed Soviet research institutes. Their names never appeared in official lists of specialists transferred under Operation WWII, further deepening the mystery. One of the few surviving local witnesses, interviewed in 1981, recalled the day the Red Army entered the airfield. He described a vast hangar still smouldering from demolition charges, with partially destroyed blueprints scattered across the floor. Soviet officers collected the papers, stuffing them into crates. He remembered diagrams of unusual aircraft shapes, with wings set at sharp angles and long fuselages resembling missiles more than planes. His testimony could not be independently verified, but it aligns with descriptions in Soviet engineering reports that mentioned tailless configurations and projected long-range devices, the possibility that the airfield was connected to early attempts at flying wing designs, similar to the Horten Ho 229, cannot be dismissed. What makes the story darker is the consistent absence of official acknowledgement. When Western historians in the 1990s requested access to Soviet military archives regarding Belarus airfields, the files were marked destroyed or not located. Yet scattered references in declassified Warsaw Pact documents mention Object 62, Belarus test site, a designation suggesting ongoing monitoring long after the war ended. Some analysts argue that the Soviets continued experiments at the site, using captured German materials as a starting point. If true, then the ghost airfield served not only as a Nazi testing ground, but as a foundation for Soviet aerospace development in the Cold War. The physical site itself has been deliberately erased. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union initiated a large-scale forestry project over the area, planting dense rows of pines to obscure aerial observation. Bulldozers leveled remaining structures, and contaminated soil was buried beneath layers of fill. By the time Western researchers gained access to Belarus in the 1990s, little remained beyond faint outlines of runways visible from the air. A few fragments of concrete and rusted steel beams were all that could be found on the ground. Local hunters, however, continue to report stumbling across sealed bunkers hidden beneath the earth, their entrances welded shut by military teams decades earlier. The ghost airfield of Belarus remains an unresolved chapter in the hidden history of the Second World War. Its existence points to the scale of Nazi experimentation in occupied territories. Far from the better-known sites in Germany, it raises questions about what technologies were being tested in the forests near Minsk, and why both Nazi Germany and later the Soviet Union sought to bury the evidence. For the villagers who lived in its shadow, the airfield was a place of fear, guarded by soldiers and echoing with unnatural sounds at night. For historians, it is a place of absence, where official records stop and silence begins. In war, not all secrets are destroyed by bombs. Some are buried in forests, hidden beneath layers of earth and deception, preserved only in fragments of testimony and whispers of what once was. The ghost airfield of Belarus stands as one of those secrets, a vanished installation whose story has been written out of the official record, but which lingers in the soil, in the memories of those who heard its engines roar, and in the unmarked files of archives that continue to deny its existence. It is not merely an abandoned runway. It is a shadow cast across history, where the lines between conquest, experimentation, and erasure remain forever blurred. Chapter 5. The Shadow Agents of Tokyo Harbor. When Japan formally surrendered in August 1945, the focus of Allied intelligence was the disarmament of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the seizure of any surviving Axis technology. In the chaos of Tokyo Bay, with dozens of submarines and surface vessels laying down their arms, Allied boarding parties discovered something that raised alarm far beyond the immediate occupation. German officers in Kriegsmarine uniforms aboard surrendered Japanese submarines. These men were not listed in the official surrender manifests. They carried identity papers stamped by the Reichsabwehr, not the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe, and their presence was never acknowledged in post-war trials. To this day, their capture remains absent from official records, surviving only in fragments buried in Allied archives and whispered testimonies from naval personnel stationed at Yokosuka. The first concrete indication of their existence comes from a set of interrogation notes discovered in 1987 within misfiled records at the US National Archives. The notes, dated September 1945, refer to unregistered German naval advisors detained aboard surrendered IJN-Y-class vessels. The document mentions 6 officers, possession of cipher equipment unknown to current Allied inventory. The pages are partially redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out under security classification codes, even decades after the war's end. One surviving line reads, "Berlin-Tokyo line compromised. Contents secured under highest classification." The vague language offers no direct answers, but it strongly suggests that a clandestine intelligence-sharing operation between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan remained active until the very end of the war. Japanese records shed little light. The surviving logs of I-400-class submarines, capable of launching aircraft, contain unexplained gaps in the weeks preceding surrender. Historians examining these records noted sudden insertions of coordinates pointing toward rendezvous points far from expected patrol areas, including one notation of cargo transfer, August 2, 1945, classified under Joint Code. No details accompany the entry, but Allied intelligence at the time had already intercepted messages indicating that Germany had attempted to transfer advanced technology to Japan via submarine. The seizure of U-234 in May 1945, carrying uranium oxide and jet parts intended for Japan, had been publicized. What the Allies never revealed was that similar transfers may have succeeded. Witness testimony from Yokosuka strengthens the suspicion. A US Navy radio man, interviewed in the 1960s, recalled seeing blacked-out trucks leave the docks under heavy guard in the early mornings following the surrender. The trucks carried large crates stenciled with German markings, escorted by military police who refused to answer questions. He remembered one officer referring to the operation by the codename Project Seal, a designation not found in any surviving naval records. The crates were driven to unknown locations, and the radio man was ordered never to mention what he saw. Decades later, his recollection remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the mysterious seizures. The German officers themselves appear to have vanished into intelligence custody. A declassified memorandum from the Office of Naval Intelligence, dated October 1945, refers to Category A prisoners transferred without public record. No names are listed, but the classification Category A usually denoted individuals with potential intelligence value. Unlike ordinary prisoners of war, such detainees were often funneled into secret interrogation programs. Researchers comparing this with CIA files from the early Cold War have noted unexplained references to assets acquired in Tokyo Harbor, origin Europe, disposition unrecorded. The phrasing is consistent with the assimilation of German technical experts into clandestine American programs, paralleling Operation Paperclip in Europe, but conducted in Asia. The most troubling element of the story lies in the equipment allegedly seized. One fragmentary report from the Far Eastern Combined Bureau, Britain's Naval Intelligence Unit, describes cipher machinery resembling but not identical to Enigma, seized in Tokyo area September 1945. The report abruptly ends with a handwritten note in the margin, "Forward to Washington, no further copies." If accurate, this would suggest that the Germans had developed a new generation of encryption devices, which were in use by Japanese forces even after Germany's surrender in May. The implications for Allied intelligence were profound. It would mean that both Axis powers maintained a covert exchange network that survived long after the war in Europe had ended. Why then was none of this revealed? The most likely answer lies in the early Cold War. Any public acknowledgement that Allied nuclear or cryptographic advances had roots in captured German-Japanese collaboration would have undermined the narrative of complete Allied superiority. Moreover, revelations that high-ranking Germans had been sheltered in Tokyo until the very last days of the war might have complicated the already fragile post-war relationship with Japan, where reconstruction depended on suppressing divisive truths. By absorbing the captured officers and their technology into secret programs, the United States ensured both control and silence. Soviet intelligence was not blind to these events. Declassified GRU cables from late 1945 complain that American forces have intercepted Berlin-Tokyo communications assets and concealed related personnel. The Soviets demanded access to captured materials, but none was ever shared. This fueled suspicion in Moscow that Washington was using the post-surrender chaos to monopolize Axis technology for its own advantage. Such distrust helped accelerate the intelligence rivalry that would define the coming decades. The capture of shadow agents in Tokyo Bay, though unacknowledged, may have been one of the first sparks of the Cold War. The fate of the German officers remains unknown. No trial records mention them, and no official repatriation lists include their names. If they were absorbed into American or British intelligence programs, they vanished into the same obscurity that swallowed many Nazi scientists and cryptographers in the late 1940s. For their families in Germany, they were listed as missing in action, presumed dead. For historians, their existence remains a half-visible shadow, glimpsed only in redacted memos and suppressed testimonies. The shadow agents of Tokyo Harbor embody the silence of suppressed history. They remind us that the end of the war did not bring clarity, only a new contest to control secrets. In the darkened docks of Yokosuka, as the rising sun was lowered and the war officially ended, another conflict was already beginning. A conflict fought not with armies, but with crates, cipher machines, and men whose names were erased from history the moment they were captured. What was hidden in those trucks that rolled away from Tokyo Harbor under the cover of dawn remains locked behind classification, the truth buried beneath the convenient myths of victory. And so, in the lingering quiet after the gunfire fades, what remains is not peace but an unsettling echo. An echo carried by locked archives, nameless graves and steel containers resting where eyes will never find them. Every sealed corridor and vanished file reminds us that endings are seldom clean, and silence is rarely innocent. The war ended on paper, but beneath its ashes lingered the shadows, unwritten, unclaimed, unresolved. To follow them is to wander a labyrinth where each turn reveals less certainty and more unease, where the closer we move toward truth, the further it retreats into smoke and shadow. Some stories are buried for a reason, some secrets refuse to die, and sometimes what we uncover in the silence is not closure, but the haunting realization that the past is still watching us from the dark.